Well, thank you. And again, as I said, I hate to interrupt. It sounds like you're all having fantastic and insightful discussions. But again, in the interest of being respectful of your time to reconvene here, regather, I want to pose to you the second question. What's happening in 6:1 to 8? What's going on here?
Talking to.
Talking to? Who's talking to? To who? Who's getting the talking to and who's doing it?
Well, it's like you alluded to earlier. I mean, Micah is letting them know, you know. I mean, it feels, well, I mean, God is obviously, but through Micah, I mean, just saying, you know, really, you know, who do you think you are?
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of how I interpret it to a certain degree. This, you know, let's, you know, stand up, plead your case before the mountains. You know, let the hills hear what you have to say.
Okay.
It's like, you gonna have any idea who it is you're dealing with here?
How does God sound in this? What's the tone or the feeling you get about God reading this?
He's pissed.
You guys are missing the point. You are missing
There's
it
something that's way off here, both of you. Okay.
Incredulous almost.
Almost incredulous.
Yeah.
What does the language sound like?
Like, are you kidding me?
Okay, yes, it sounds like that. I'm asking a more mundane question. What does it sound like when you get this kind of address?
It's a courtroom situation.
It sounds like we're in court. Stand up and plead your case. And indeed, there are several places in the prophets. There's one in Isaiah, there's one in Hosea, there's one here in Micah, there's a Jeremiah passage that seem to be structured as if they're legal cases. And indeed, people who study the Old Testament have tried to categorize these as a particular form that's used, called, they label it very often a covenant lawsuit, that it is God taking us to court for our unfaithfulness, for our desertion and abandonment of the covenant relationship we have with Him and what that means for us and people around us. So if it sounds slightly ominous or foreboding, I mean, the point is, God is suing us. And He's saying, you will have a chance to present your case. But what is so intimidating, you think back to Job, who wanted his day in court with God and said, I know I'll lose, but I want a chance to give my case. I'm going to lose big, but I want you to do this, and you're not letting me do it, God. And he wants an opportunity to present his side, but it's still a rather intimidating, awe-inspiring, fearsome thing to think that the lawyer for the prosecution and your judge are God. And there are none of the legal firms in Champaign-Urbana that are up to taking on that case. No insult to friends who are lawyers. It's just, this is pretty overwhelming.
So I also see that in 3, my people that have done to you, how have I burdened you, answer me. There's that, and that's not, I'm just saying I kind of feel that it's compassion.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
there's clearly compassion.
The sense of, he saying what he did, you've been really ungrateful.
Almost hurt.
Almost hurt.
Yes.
You can't really, it's rhetorical again.
It's a fascinating combination.
But he's asking, he's giving him the latitude to say, how have I done to deserve, what have I done to deserve this? Even though there isn't anything.
Stand up and plead your case, verse 1. Answer me, but then there's no response. You're right, it is intimidating. God is taking me to court, and at the same time, there is throughout His gracious mercy and the opportunity even to speak. And then the opportunity to go back and forth with God about what does this mean and what are we supposed to do. So God, even the fact He's addressing them through the prophet Micah, is grace and love and mercy. So a covenant lawsuit, or what the Hebrew word riv, R-I-V or R-I-B, is the transliteration into English, is the word for the covenant lawsuit or the lawsuit in this case. And you'll actually see that in commentaries. They'll talk about the Lord's reeve against his people. So just in case you hear that. So you talked about how the passage flows. What was the first major stanza or paragraph? I mean, it's poetry. It's prophetic poetry and an oracle. So paragraphs and stanzas. The idea is, what's the first thought unit that you decided in your groups here?
1 to 3.
1 to 3. And what is that?
Kind of like the opening statements.
Okay, it's the opening statements. This is the beginning of the court case. How about the other groups? What did you have as your first unit, just to think of how it develops? You went with 1 to 3. How about the back group? 2? 1 and 2. Okay. Then what's next? Let's go ahead and break the passage down. What did you think was next? Following that.
4 and 5.
Which are what? What's ensuing?
Reminding them of what he'd done.
Okay, so he's looking back at the relational history. Okay. How about the others of you? Did you? Same.
It's almost like he's asserting, okay, this, talking about the covenant relationship,
Okay.
if that's what this suit is, okay, this was my part of the bargain.
Mm-hmm.
This is how I upheld.
This is how I performed so
Yeah.
far.
Yeah, okay. This is what I've done. Here's God's input into the relationship. Okay? What's the next unit?
6 to 7. I wait, but nobody.
Yeah, nobody else is saying anything, so Nathan is just
7.
jumping in. That's fine. 6 and 7, which represent what? Okay, it's God's people in some way this is their exploration of, okay, what do we do? And then that leaves 8 as the last unit. So if you all divided that off, the verse got its own section that way. Okay, so here we have the book of Micah 6, 1 to 8. And I'm going to give you this. It just represents my outline for the passage. So as we talk about it, and you can critique it as we go along. But we need to think a little bit about what we got going on here. So we start with the opening statements, the summons to court. And I treat it as 1 and 2, and I'll share why. So we begin with a simple call to listen. Listen to what the Lord says. It gets your attention. It marks off the beginning of an oracle and really a major section of the book, which we'll see eventually in full context. And it's addressed to whom?
People of Judah.
The people of Judah. It's Micah's audience here. Maybe the people in Jerusalem especially. We don't know where he's standing as he says this. So, hear God, and then the rest of verse 1 gives an invitation to mount your defense in court. Plead your case in court. Stand up. Plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. So it calls on the listeners. This is not going to be unfair. God is not a bully. God says, here's your chance. Plead your case. And God invokes nature as if nature is the jury. In this case, it's the mountains and the hills that listen to the case. And he chooses, of course, features of the natural terrain in Israel, around Jerusalem. If you go there today, that's the most prominent feature, are rocks and hills, or mountains, depending on how you classify them. Still the same. Now, in the cultures, yes?
So is he calling on the rocks and hills as the jury or as the witnesses?
It can be taken either way. People have suggested they're witnesses. People have suggested they're the jury. I just said jury because you're pleading your case before them, which seems to be more the function of a jury. In other words, we've got God, we've got the people, and in the cultures around, you can invoke natural features because they are infused with life as deities, but that's not what's going on here. God is simply setting up in this picture, he's setting up a courtroom. We need a jury. And so we call on natural features that have been there and have certainly been witnesses of Judah's behavior over the years. So in a sense, they serve as both witness and jury.
And there are
Didn't
no
he call
people.
on them as witnesses when the covenant was initially set up? That,
Yes.
you know, so in some sense, it's calling back to, in the same way,
Exactly.
you know, that you're witnesses of the arrangement, now you're serving as jury or witnesses of the prosecution.
Right.
And there are no people that can be on the jury.
Yeah, there's
He's
nobody.
using all the people, so who's going to have a jury? It's either going to have to be the hills or mountains or nothing.
Exactly. There's nobody left other than either God or the accused here. So who do we bring in for the jury? Okay, so God presents his case. Two, really, we get the indictment. Hear, O mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth, for the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge, this is the reeve, against Israel. So, the involved segments of nature become even more all-encompassing. At first it was the mountains and the hills. Now it's the mountains and the foundations of the earth on which the hills rest. So the jury, or alternatively the witnesses, are growing in their scope. So the people are called to listen to the Lord in the first part of verse 1. Then the mountains and hills need to hear what God's people plead. And now they're asked to hear God. And the threatening tone, in a sense, is, of course, that you're being taken to court. Nobody likes to be summoned. When the police officer walks in with the document and puts it down on your desk at work, that's not a great day at the office, usually, for most people. This is very, very frightening. But the core here is that he's taking us to court. He's suing us over our sin, over our rebellion, over our hard-hearted shaking our fist in God's face and going our own way. Notice that he doesn't identify the accused until the very end of verse 2. It's actually held off. You have the court language, you've got the witnesses or jury brought in. You get the sense God's the lawyer for the prosecution, and then you find out who is being taken to court. God's people. Okay, so we have our initial summons to court. God's case, I take starting in 3 and going through 5. And the reason for that is we have a clear address for the people at 3 that kind of marks this off. Now God, through the prophet, turns to his audience, my people, and asks them an opening question, which is, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. So he begins by gathering their attention, then enumerates the history of his benefit. What has God done that would have tired you out? What has God done that's so offensive? And of course, this is asked in a way that expects and requires the listener to go. It's a rhetorical question, but it expects you to go, nothing, of course. Now you ask the question in a way that expects an answer, and the answer is nothing at all. Then it follows with that which gives God a claim on us. So what gives God a claim on us? Does God have a stake in you? And what is that?
He redeemed them from Egypt, and he made them his people. That's what they did.
How about us here tonight?
Did that.
Same redemption, right?
Okay, it is the whole story of salvation. It is the very fact that I can know God in a personal and intimate manner, that, and anything in my life where he's guided me, protected me, led me, worked in my disasters, whatever it is, that I can trace his hand and his presence. There is his claim on me. So this is, although You and I don't look back to an immediate past coming through the wilderness or out of Egypt or find that our identity. Nonetheless, it's the same principle at work today for the follower of Christ, very clearly. So, God has a claim. 4 and 5, then, his case is largely remembering the relationship. And he goes back. Evidently, his questions are met with silence. He says, answer me. And I think you have to have a pause there. Otherwise, you wouldn't say, answer me. And then he presents his case. Here it comes. God's just asked, what? Have I burdened you? And the word connotes the idea of weighing you down, putting a big, heavy thing on your back that would crush you, oppressive and crushing. Notice that as God through the prophet goes on, what is the first thing he invokes? Have I crushed you down? No, actually, I brought you up. The language, and there's even in the Hebrew a pun in the sound as to what the two words sound like. So they're juxtaposed with each other. Did I push you down? No, I brought you up. I brought you up out of Egypt. God has been, far from having burdened his people, he has been the source of far-reaching benefits over the years. And so God recounts some of the highlights, the central foci of the formation, guarding, guiding, protecting, and empowering of Israel in its early years. We start with the Exodus. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. He got them out of oppression, out of one of the most inhumane situations imaginable in Egypt. And God redeemed them. And he gave them leaders, this outstanding leadership family. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Moses, of course, who is the lawgiver, the shepherd of the people, the human founder of Israel as a great nation, and a prophet according to Deuteronomy. Aaron, high priest and mediator, and Miriam, prophetess and poet. Moses and his siblings. And they went on into the wilderness. Now notice how it takes the story. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, counseled and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Which, of course, takes us where? We have the Exodus. We got out of Egypt. Balak and Balaam. Where's Israel now?
It was in the wilderness.
We're wandering in the wilderness. So we go to the next stage. God evokes the whole foundation and creation of this nation. I got you out of slavery and brought you to myself, and I guided you through the wilderness, which is the mention of Balak and Balaam evokes the 40 years out there. And of course, what are Balak and Balaam? Well, yes, God got them through. He gave them food, he gave them drink, he preserved them from attack and threat, deception and sin. And now we get two ungodly people in opposition. What did Balak want?
He wanted to destroy Israel.
He wanted to destroy them. He didn't want them to come near Moab. He's the king of Moab. And so he decides that the best thing to do is he outsources. He hires a professional curser, Balaam, a prophet. And Balaam, of course, only blesses them. God turns their enemies' curses into blessings. He pronounces God's favor and grace and glowing future for God's people, much to Balak's total frustration. However, if you go on beyond Numbers 22 to 24, where God switches the curse intended by Balak into a Balaam blessing again and again, we get Numbers 25 and Numbers 31, which we find out Balaam felt badly that he hadn't been able to accommodate Balak. So he goes back to him, apparently, and says, you know, I can't curse them because I'm professionally bound to God when he tells me to bless them. I got to do it. But I can give you this advice. And he sets up this very compelling plan for how they could seduce the Israelites into idolatry and immorality, which is carried out successfully and ends up resulting in another major conflict. So in 25, the Israelites defect from God at the instigation of Moab. The plan came from Balaam, so he wasn't as nice as we had hoped. 31, they end up destroying the people who have done this. The Moabites and Midianites seem to be together in this, and